The reality is this, that this is not Putin's war, this is Russia's war. That deep, I think, in the Russian DNA is that sense that Ukraine has no right to exist as a nation. That is old-style, imperial Russian, Tsarist, Soviet thinking. The only way that Europe and the transatlantic region is going to be able to enjoy peace and security for the next 50 years, maybe longer, is by putting in place a band of deterrent steel around Eastern Europe to include Ukraine. The Second World War went on for 6 years. I think we need to be prepared for the same length of time.
Valery Gerasimov, Russian Army general, serving as the chief of general staff and the first deputy of Minister Shoigu. You met him and you welcome him at your home. Is that correct?
It is completely correct.
Russia and NATO. Putin threatens NATO with nuclear war. And if they send troops to Ukraine, especially after President Macron interview and his claims, how close are we to this case scenario, in your opinion? Is it just or it's possibly mutual intimidation game?
Well, firstly, Putin's nuclear saber rattling is absolutely intimidation. It is designed to frighten the West, and particularly to frighten President Biden, and it has resulted in the real concern in the White House about escalating the conflict and leading to nuclear. Now, personal view, no, it is a really dangerous threat. Any talk of nuclear is really dangerous, and it would be an absolute catastrophe if Putin decided to risk a nuclear weapon. Of course it would. I think we have to assume, though, that America, NATO have eyes on all nuclear facilities in Russia and would pick up the outload of any nuclear warhead with a view to marrying it up with the delivery means. I think we also must assume, and I hope this is the case, that America and leaders in the West, particularly the American president, has made it 100% clear to Russia that any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would result in massive conventional retaliation by NATO and led by America. And a very clear statement that if you use a nuclear weapon, we will use all our conventional means, and the West and NATO can outgun Russia any time if it chose to destroy every Russian military capability in Ukraine. So I think there needs to be some strong talk here when in the face of this nuclear saber rattling. So I think that's. Now there was another point you made there.
How close are we to this case scenario?
Well, the irony is, the weaker we appear to be, the closer we are, the greater the risks of this scenario. Defeat of Russia will remove this scenario. It's still a risk, of course it is. But defeat of Russian capabilities in Ukraine, which is after all precisely what President Zelensky's war aims are, defeat of Russia and the regaining of sovereign Ukrainian territory, does not impact on Mother Russia, but it is about achieving that. But it's the way, as I come back to my other point, which is the way to deter Russia is to be strong. Any form of weakness to Russia will only be exploited by Russia.
Putin and NATO, it was the time when he wanted to join NATO. But what happened? Why and what made him so anti-NATO? Do you remember?
Well, you're right. He said in 1999, soon after he became president, that he would not rule out Russia joining NATO. What happened? Well, I don't know what changed his mindset, except that from the very start, I know from other sources that Putin modeled himself on Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, and Stalin. So that was not a very good omen from the start. He made it pretty clear at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 that there was a complete reset in Russia-NATO relations. When Russia incorporated Crimea into the Russian Federation on March the 18th, 2014, What Putin said there made it very clear to anybody who read that speech, and I had an English transcript of that speech on my desk the next day, very clear that Russia was on a collision course with NATO and the West. And that ultimately which is why, one of the reasons I wrote that book, because I felt that we really needed a wake-up call to stress the very real threat. However, much of what many of us were saying about the risks of Russia were ignored by the West. So coming back to why did Putin change? I think the man becomes more of an autocrat, more determined. He becomes rich because of Russian oil, and he ultimately is an autocrat who can only see the way to maintain power, which is by rebuilding a Russian empire.
Valery Gerasimov, Russian Army general, serving as the chief of general staff and the first deputy of Minister Shoigu. You met him, and you welcomed him at your home. Is that correct?
It is completely correct. Yeah, I met him on several occasions.
What he's like, and are you still in touch?
No, I'm not in touch. He is, I think, he's a sort of old-fashioned Soviet general straight out of central casting. I remember my first meeting when he was the deputy chief of the general staff. And don't forget that the NATO strategy stated in 2010 at the NATO summit was that Russia should become NATO's most important strategic partner. And so I was in and out of Moscow several times. I spoke at the General Staff Academy. My first visit, I met Gerasimov as Deputy Chief of the General Staff. And you have to remember, the NATO priority at that stage in 2011, 2012 was Afghanistan. And leading up to the drawdown of the International Security Assistance Force mission, the ISAF mission in Afghanistan, which was scheduled for 2014. And so NATO needed to have Russia on side, not least for the extraction of various logistic aspects of it. And of course, there was a common interest in combating Islamic terrorism. But I realized very quickly that we were talking past each other. Because I talked about NATO's priorities, I talked about Afghanistan, I talked about this. But then he came straight back at me and said, what about ballistic missile defense? You are threatening Russia's security. And it just brought home to me how, in many ways, we in NATO had put the whole issue of deterrence of Russia into a box after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We assumed Russia would never become a threat again. But I think we were naive. And what happened in 2014 blew that apart, i.e. the invasion of Crimea and annexation of Crimea, blew that apart and demonstrated, well, arguably, I would say, and I felt this at the time actually, the invasion of Georgia in 2008 was Putin changing the boundaries of Europe by force. The return of iron and blood to Europe, the politics of Europe, to quote Bismarck. But Europe didn't pick up. NATO didn't wake up.
Why?
Well, why didn't it? Because nobody felt threatened. And I think that it was because nobody really understood Russia. I think that the influence of Russian money in London had a lot to do with it, certainly towards official British attitudes. I got a lot of pushback when that book came out. People didn't want to hear a retired general saying there was a threat of war with Russia.
But you are a British general. You know somebody, from outside. You are there. You are the most powerful voice for the British public and for the British leaders.
I mean, I can remember the then Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, being quizzed by John Humphreys on the Today programme after that book came out. And John Humphreys said to him, Foreign Secretary, what do you think of this British general who's written a book saying there will be a war with Russia? And his response was, firstly, that he thought that I'd written the book purely as a way of paying off my mortgage, which was a bit of a dig. But he said, quote unquote, I know nobody who thinks like that. So if you've got somebody like that, the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain in 2016 saying, I know nobody who thinks that Russia could be a threat, after what happened in Ukraine, after what happened in Kyiv, in Crimea, then I think what you have is this. I go back to the parallels with the 1930s, with what Hitler was doing in Germany, what Hitler was saying in Germany, what Hitler was talking about in terms of Lebensraum to the east and eliminating the Jews, and yet nobody else in Europe really woke up to it. I mean, a few people did, clearly. I mean, Winston Churchill was shouting from the rooftops about it, but there were very few of him.
When you had Gerasimov at your home, was he different than during the official meetings?
Oh, he was.
Did he make you drink vodka?
No, funny enough, interestingly, he's not a drinker.
Oh.
Which really surprised me. He was very charming. He brought my wife flowers.
He speaks English, doesn't he?
No. We did everything through interpreters. And, we had lunch, and I produced a bit of wine at lunch. And I remember, we had some toasts. And I remember him really not drinking the wine at all, maybe a tiny sip. So that did surprise me, because that's not the experience I'd held elsewhere in Russia.
Wine is considered as a female drink. It's not taken
maybe I should have produced vodka.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I wasn't going to produce vodka, I'm afraid, at lunch.
Yeah, it's either vodka or some of the strong spirits.
Yeah. Maybe I got it wrong then.
So I guess you're not in touch.
No. Funny enough, the last time, going back to your strong spirits, I took him a very nice bottle of malt whiskey, so hopefully he might have enjoyed that.
Yeah, I'm sure he will. Soviet general, Soviet serviceman says a lot, doesn't it? It paints the portrait, so you get the idea. Aren't they different? Because it's the change of the political landscape. It's he was in the Soviet army, and then it's Russian army. Didn't you feel like changes? Because in Ukraine there are people who joined army because they wanted to defend big motherland in Soviet time, and they naively believed in all of that. But when Ukraine got independence, they became Ukraine patriots and still defended Ukraine. With Russia, what happened with the mentality of those servicemen, or, for example, Gerasimov? Did you feel this shift or change that it's a new generation or new approach in the army?
No, I don't. I didn't feel any of that. I think you have to understand as well that what the Russian army went through, as what Russia went through after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was a real sense of humiliation that you had, and there had been Ukrainians who went through this because they were part of the Soviet army, of course. When, for example, the Soviet Union collapsed and the group of Soviet forces in Germany, in what was then East Germany, had to withdraw back to their respective countries, that there were families living in tents and soldiers and officers having to moonlight as taxi drivers in order to generate enough income to feed their families. So this was a really tough time for them. But as far as Gerasimov is concerned, and this sort of has been borne out by the way Russia has conducted its war in Ukraine, which is no different from the way warfare was conducted on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. The same destruction of cities, the massacre of civilians, I hate to say it, of course, the use of rape as a weapon of war, and the absolute use of uncontrolled force, the use of what are horrifically called meat grinder tactics, the sending of waves of young Russians mobilized at the point of a gun on the streets and given virtually no training, and then sent into mass attacks where huge numbers of them have died. This is no different from Russia in the Second World War. It's no different from Russia in the First World War. This is the Russian way of war. There is no sense, and I can remember taking Gerasimov around the NATO, the strategic headquarters at SHAPE in Belgium, at Mons in Belgium, and pointing out to him at that stage we were building a new command center, a comprehensive crisis operations management center. which was all about how best to integrate military capability with non-military capability, because we recognize in NATO and in the West that the way to achieve decisive military effect is dependent not just on the military, but it's about building bridges with multiple stakeholders, with United Nations organizations, with non-governmental organizations, with other international organizations, all of whom have an interest in what happens on the battlefield. And if you can combine that effect, you can be more effective militarily. As far as Gerasimov was concerned, that notion was completely foreign to him. For him, he is looking at the application of force without any constraints at all, and we've seen that writ large in the battlefields of Ukraine.
Has your attitude changed to your Russian acquaintances, particularly Gerasimov and other colleagues, after the war crimes Russian army did in Bucha, Irpin, Izum, when you saw all this evidence, things you just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I've got a few Russian acquaintances, and those I have are UK-based because they can't go back to Russia. So you can't blame them for what has been done in the name of their country. But I think I'm really disappointed by the fact that despite the diaspora of Russians who left Russia, particularly after the first mobilization, I asked myself, where are those standing up and shouting about Putin? Where are the demonstrations outside Russian embassies? And I think we have to recognize that, yes, there are brave Russians who are, as much as they can, opposing Putin. But the reality is that this is not Putin's war. This is Russia's war. That deep, I think, in the Russian DNA is that sense that Ukraine has no right to exist as a nation, that it is somehow an indistinguishable part of Russia. And hence this, so we have to recognize and that's not going to go away. Russia will only change if what was done to Germany in 1945 is done to Russia, and that's not going to happen. And so therefore, we in Europe and the transatlantic community have to recognize that the long-term relationship with Russia has got to recognize the threat Russia poses to our way of life, the Western way of life, liberty, democracy, freedom of speech, all the things, the rule of law, all the things that we hold dear. And the only way we can protect that is through effective NATO deterrence through NATO.
Let's do some debunking myths about NATO. Russia was promised that NATO would not enlarge. What's wrong with this statement? Are we dealing here with who's owning a historical narrative and deploying it to gain advantage?
NATO promised not to put troops into East Germany. NATO never promised not to admit newly formed liberal democracies, former colonies of the Soviet Union, members of the Warsaw Pact, who of their own free will and the free will of their electorates applied to become NATO members. So I think this is a historical myth that Russia continues to push. And again and again, Putin says this, and again, we must refute that.
Myth 2. Russia is entitled to a defensive perimeter, a sphere of privileged interests, including the territory of other states. Do you agree?
No. 100% no. That is old-style, imperial Russian, Tsarist, Soviet thinking. And Putin is guilty now. And I find this absolutely appalling and revolting that he should talk in such imperialist terms.
Myth 3. The people of Ukraine, Belarus and Russia are one nation. By the way, you quote Putin in your book about it when he talks about Ukraine after the Crimea annexation. And you're not questioning it. And when I read it in your book, and I was like, you read history in Oxford. Why didn't you say anything? It wasn't the point in your narrative, I have to say. It's not like you stating it and supporting it, no. But he says it, and the problem with the West people, with the people in Britain or any other country which is far from Ukraine, they take it as a truth. They take it as a historical fact, which has nothing to do with reality.
I'm quoting Putin. I mentioned the speech he gave on the 18th of March, 2014. In that speech, quote unquote, "We are one nation. Kyiv is the mother of Russian cities." And he's gone on like that. And I'm saying that, putting those words in the president's mouth, to make the point that he is determined to remove Ukraine from the map. And he was determined then, and he's just as determined to do that now. So this is, again, this is quoting Putin's words to try and convey the very present and real sense of threat that he poses.
But you do not agree with it?
Of course not. No. I mean, Ukraine. Ukraine is a free, proud nation, and I was very clear of that from visiting. Ukraine has been and any understanding of European and Ukrainian history. Ukraine has always been a nation in its own right.
Yes. Your book, the most pleasant part. I was looking forward to it. And talking about Ukraine, your book starts from the events in Kharkiv, and you described it so clearly, so precise. Have you been in Kharkiv?
I've never been to Kharkiv, I'm afraid.
Wow. Because your book, War with Russia, let me show you. I did really enjoy it very, very much, and I absolutely sure there should become TV series. It's very dynamic, it's very interesting, engaging, especially for those who like something about adventures, spies, war, and the secret services. It's definitely should be on BBC or Netflix, something like that. And when you describe in Kharkiv and its central part and the square and where people sit and everything, I understand you have this writer's talent because the book is very interesting. But I wasn't sure if you were there. You have several locations. You have locations in Russia. You have locations in the US. It's all very clear. But Kharkiv, I said, is there a story when you visited? And probably it's from your memories.
Sadly not. I'd love to put it right, but I fear that the Kharkiv of May 2024 is not the place of the Kharkiv of the pre-war Kharkiv. It will be a very sadly battered but proud Kharkiv. One day I'll put that right.
Yes, but you probably felt yourself when you're in Ukraine and the closer you get to the front line, and Kharkiv is one front line because it's so close to Russian border, the energy of life is so strong. Would you agree? Because when I come back to London, I feel like everything is sleepy here. In Ukraine, they open new cafes, new restaurants, they try a new menu, and it's in the air. It's like today or never.
I guess that's absolutely, and probably rather as, I suspect if you'd been in London in 1940, in the middle of the Blitz, you'd have probably experienced the same sense of energy and determination.
Probably, yeah. In your book, War with Russia, it is powerful, intense, and being honest with you, I had the whole range of emotions. Sometimes I had to put it down because it was painful, especially when you describe how confident Russian Secret Service in Ukraine. And I know it is true. It was, and especially before 2014, and even now, there are a lot of spies from Russia there. And as a Ukrainian, it is physically painful. Anyway, this book you wrote there as a wake-up call. Do you think it worked out? Do you think the general public heard you? And maybe you have noticed some shift or the actions which were inspired by your book?
I can't say that any actions were inspired by the book, but what has happened certainly in the last 2 years, I think, and this is attitudes have changed. Attitudes have changed across Europe. There is now recognition of the threat Russia poses. We now have politicians articulating that threat. They're not doing enough, but they are saying there's a threat, and they are beginning to increase defense expenditure. NATO's come a long way. From the NATO summit in 2014, when there was a recognition that a new order had fallen on Europe. You now see NATO troops deployed in the Baltic states. That never happened before. They're not enough, but there's a start. NATO's putting in plans to defend itself, to reinforce its defenses in the east. All this is happening. So there is a new spirit in the air, unquestionably, but I can't claim any responsibility for it, just tangentially, perhaps.
You wrote in the book, NATO should aim to foster a strategic partnership with Russia. What do you mean?
Well, this is quoting the NATO strategy of 2010, when it said that that Russia should become NATO's most important strategic partner. And this was, in a sense, highlighting how far NATO had to go to recognize the change of circumstances. And I think if you read it carefully, what you'll see, what that says is, how could NATO possibly say that we should be forming a strategic partnership with Russia when Russia is bent on becoming the threat that it is to our defense and our security?
It's one thing. And the other thing, how you can build partnership with people who are, with their mentality, Soviet generals, with Soviet mentality. The partnership with any Western alliance, it should be people of new generation. Shoigu or Gerasimov or Putin, they do not seem the new generation.
I don't think there's any prospect of any partnership with Russia. I go back to my point that we have to recognize this is all about the long-term breakup of the Russian Empire. Russia has only ever been an empire. Empire and imperial thinking is woven into every aspect of its statehood. I pick up that quote you gave earlier about Russia should have its own defensive zone of countries subject to Russia, words to that effect. That's not going to change. And this is going to be a generational issue. And the only way that Europe and the transatlantic region is going to be able to enjoy peace and security for the next 50 years, maybe longer, is by putting in place a band of deterrent steel around Eastern Europe to include Ukraine, to make it absolutely clear that Russia has to stay where it is. And if Russia tries it on against Ukraine, and who knows, one day that might include Belarus if Belarus becomes free. Long way to go there. That we have to prepare, be ready for that.
You wrote about 2014 and Crimea annexation. We couldn't even consider doing anything to counter it, as Ukraine was no member of NATO. Do you think, was it a mistake to allow Putin to get away with it?
It was a mistake to appease him after the Crimea, and I stand by that. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, an attack on one is an attack on all, and therefore all are treaty bound to come to the aid of a NATO member of attack, did not apply to Ukraine because Ukraine was not a NATO member. However, after the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea, where were the signatories of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, under which, as you know very well, Britain, France, America, Russia agreed to guarantee Ukrainian security and sovereignty, providing Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. So where were they? Where were Britain, France, and America in guaranteeing Ukrainian sovereignty and security? As we've already said, Prime Minister Cameron was absent. He left it to Sarkozy and Merkel, President Sarkozy and Merkel of France and Germany, to conduct the Minsk agreements, which were no more than appeasement of Russia.
Well, I'll tell you the other thing. The guest on this podcast, General Kondratyuk, he was with the Secret Service. Later, he became the head of Defense Intelligence. And he told in the interview that when Crimea was annexed, British, American ambassadors, other ambassadors of European countries were convincing Ukrainian authorities not to stand up, not to fight. They promised to get back Crimea through diplomatic channels because they were not ready for refugees, they were not ready for anything. And again, our statement today, Ukrainian war is somewhere there. It's not at our borders. Putin, in your book, you describe in him, and there are quite often you give this insight into his meetings with the ministers, how they're terrified of him. Probably they are, I don't know. But Putin is cold, clever, calculated, and very powerful leader. That's what you think of him. Because I'm asking it, when I was producing a podcast with John Sweeney about Putin's poisoning, and I did a lot of research on his biography, his childhood, parents, his youth, and it's not the person I have the image or impressions of. What do you think of him as a person, as a human being, if there's something left?
Well, I think he's pretty evil. He's an evil man. He's done appalling things, and he is all of those things. He's cold, he's ruthless, he's calculating, and he's a bully. And so what do you do with bullies? You stand up to them, and you make it quite clear that you're not going to roll over. So I think he's an appalling man. I've read a couple of biographies as well. But I also produced in the book, it's a long time since I wrote it, but what I wanted to do was to create an embodiment of the ruthless autocrat who was going to stop at nothing to achieve his aims. And I think actually the way he has behaved, that thinking has been more than borne out.
Yeah. You're clearly worried about Baltic states in the book. I can see it's quite often how your heart aches and you emphasize it again and again. And Putin's appetite. And you mentioned your interview to the Baltic TV where you were so sure there is no threat to those things. What made you feel that way back then?
You're right to highlight that, and I recognise that I was wrong to say there is no threat from this regime, because I was basing that on the perceived NATO assessment of the threat. What made me change my mind was being taken by the then Latvian Chief of Defence Staff, who became a very good friend, Raimons Grauber, to the Latvian command centre, and being shown the most recent incursion by Russian aircraft. And what was happening was that Russian aircraft, troop carriers, Ilyushin 76s, which carry airborne troops, 12 or 14 of them, so quite a significant, and it's only about a 40-minute flying time from their base at a place called Pskov to Riga. And they were taking off from Pskov, flying up to the Latvian border, and then the Latvian radars and air defense would be alerted. They would fly up the border, and then they'd go round in a circuit, and then they'd come back, and they'd do it again. And so it just gave me the impression, made me realize the extent to which the intimidation and constant testing of Latvian and other Baltic states' defenses was happening. Now, the Latvians, the Estonians, and the Lithuanians, they know what Russia's about. They know what the Soviet Union was about.
They don't miss Soviet Union, I guess.
They do not miss the Soviet Union. And one of the first places I visited on my first visit to Riga was the Museum of Occupation. And just as I'm sure it's the same in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, there's not a family who did not experience deportation of loved ones to Siberia and imprisonment. And it's a terrible story. So it made me understand Russia rather better.
Yeah, and Russian mentality. British solidarity for Baltics mentioned in your book. What do you think of British solidarity and help for Ukraine, especially at the beginning of full-scale invasion? I
think it wasn't bad. That's a bit of British understatement. I think it was good. I think, forgive me, I think credit where credit is due. I don't hold have any respect for Boris Johnson, but his government took the lead, largely thanks to Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, I think, in shipping anti-tank weapons anti-aircraft weapons to Ukraine. And that set the tone. And I think without that, many other nations would not have followed suit. So it started them. And then, of course, since then, who were the first to send tanks? Britain. Not very many, but they did that. And I think Britain has continued to say and do the right thing, but I just wish they'd give a bit more.
Do you know, there's, I don't know if it's the fact, but I've heard the rumors from the Whitehall that the weapon for Ukraine was prepared by Ben Wallace in October 2021. Boris Johnson was sitting on it until the full-scale invasion happened. And everyone who, from Ukrainian side, like on official visits or came across Ben Wallace, they just adore him. And it's female, male, it doesn't matter. Everyone is so impressed. I know for the white Ukrainian public, for the general, they adore Boris Johnson, and I witnessed it myself. He's like Beatles in 60s for Ukrainians. Citizens, but people who professionally came across Ben Wallace, they are absolutely smashed, they adore him, and there's just the endless compliments and kindest and sweetest words about him.
Well, I can't really comment on that except to say that if Johnson was sitting on it up until the last minute, shame on him, I'm afraid.
I can't claim it's true, but that's one. We mentioned it a bit about Lord Cameron and his role as a Prime Minister in 2014 and Foreign Secretary right now. Is there anything about how he's been effective, or would you like to add anything? Because I'm asking you, not for the purpose of gossiping or saying something, but you were the leadership position. You were at the top of the such important in our context of conversation, NATO organization. And I would like to know about your thinking, your emotions, because as a leader yourself, yes, you're retired right now, but it hasn't changed your nature, your way of thinking, and you can see what's happening. It's definitely different perception as for me as a just commoner or journalist watching it and seeing. And possibly I don't understand what can be done or what can be said while you can fill those gaps.
I've never met Mr. Cameron, or Lord Cameron as I should say now, but I would say two things. As far as the present is concerned, I think it's very dangerous to lecture people without really demonstrating leadership yourself. And I mean particularly lecturing other European governments to increase defence spending, when this government has been responsible in effectively the neutralisation of British military capability. And that started, I'm afraid to say, back in 2010. When Cameron became Prime Minister. And the quality and the capability of our armed forces has been fundamentally undermined ever since then. So I think you've got to be very careful about broadcasting to other nations that you should increase your defence spending when Britain is not, I believe, pulling its weight.
How relevant NATO experience in Iraq and Afghanistan for this Russian war in Ukraine?
Well, it's a very different war. Iraq and Afghanistan were fundamentally, they were counterinsurgency campaigns. I mean, they were bloody, there was some very hard fighting, some very vicious fighting. But you can't begin to equate them with the nature of what we're seeing in the Ukraine war, which is full-scale industrial war, total war, involving civilians, involving communities, and requiring the total mobilization of the state for state survival. So they can't begin to equate. And this requires a different approach to warfighting. This requires formations of a scale and size. I come back to my point about the undermining of Western military capabilities. And one of the problems we face, of course, is the legacy of fighting these counterinsurgency wars, which has undermined that capability for large-scale warfighting, which we took for granted during the Cold War, and which we demonstrated in the first Gulf War, for example.
What would you say to the Ukrainian soldiers on the front line?
Firstly, massive respect. I don't underestimate the challenges they face. They're demonstrating extraordinary courage and bravery, and they don't need any armchair general from sitting in London to give them advice. But I just wish them all the very best and pray for their success and their survival.
How the Russian war in Ukraine will end? For what the things how they look now?
It must end in Ukrainian victory, and the defeat of Russia in Ukraine, and the achievement of Ukraine's war aims, and for Ukraine to become part of NATO.
I know it's a silly question, but I'm talking to the experienced general. How long do you think we need to prepare ourselves to this desirable result?
The Second World War went on for 6 years. I think we need to be prepared for the same length of time. I think we're 2 years in. I think this is going to take another 2 years minimum.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you for watching. I talked today to General Sir Richard Shirreff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Please share your thoughts for everything you've heard today, and don't forget, like, share, subscribe, and yes, let's discuss everything you've heard in the comments. Thank you.